The first thing people heard was not an announcement, it was gunfire. Shots cracked through the quiet streets around the presidential palace in Guinea-Bissau just after sunrise, and within minutes families were rushing away from the sound, mothers gripping their children's hands, elderly men leaning on canes trying to understand what was happening. What had been a hopeful week of national elections suddenly dissolved into fear, and before the dust even settled, the world received confirmation a coup was underway. Just hours earlier, citizens were waiting for the official results of their presidential election, an election that many believed could finally bring stability to one of West Africa's most fragile nations. But instead, two men, incumbent President Umaro Sissoco Embalo and opposition contender Fernando Dias, each declared themselves the winner before results were even released. That moment of political chaos was all the military needed. Before dawn broke, they appeared on state television calling themselves the High Military Command for the Restoration of National Security and Public Order, announcing that they had seized control to protect the nation from an alleged plot involving powerful drug barons. For the people running from those gunshots, none of that mattered. What they felt was the return of a nightmare, another moment where power changes hands, not through ballots, but through bullets. With the borders closed, a national curfew in place, and the whereabouts of the president still unknown, ordinary families once again found themselves trapped inside a story they never chose to be part of. And so a question rises not just for Africa, but for all of us, watching from afar. When a nation's elections become too weak to guarantee peace, what future is left for its people? If you believe that the struggle for stability in Africa deserves truth, not headlines, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe so more people can understand what's happening behind the breaking news. Long before the world heard any official statement, the people of Guinea-Bissau were already living the reality of what was happening. The day began with confusion and fear. Outside the presidential palace, where families usually pass on their way to markets and work, the sudden eruption of heavy gunfire shredded the morning calm. Women carrying baskets dropped them instinctively. Children ran without knowing where to run. Motorbikes screeched to a stop as their riders jumped off and ducked behind walls. No one waited for explanations. Instinct told them something terrible had begun. This was supposed to be a week of democratic transition. General elections had just been held, and the nation was preparing for the release of official results. Guinea-Bissau has known instability for decades, but even so, many hoped this election might become a turning point. Yet instead of clarity, the hours leading up to the results spiraled into political fog. Two main contenders, incumbent President Umaro Sissoco Embalo and opposition challenger Fernando José Dias, each stepped forward declaring victory on their own terms. Their claims were bold, public, and made long before the official Electoral Commission could speak. For a country with such a painful history of contested power, this was a dangerous moment. It opened a crack wide enough for the military to step through. Not long after both men declared themselves winners, the armed forces appeared on national television from their headquarters. They introduced themselves with a name that carried both confidence and threat: the High Military Command for the Restoration of National Security and Public Order. Their message was direct. They claimed to have uncovered an ongoing plot to destabilize the country, a plan they insisted involved powerful drug barons working hand in hand with political actors. The timing of their accusation, just one day before the election results were to be announced, was impossible to ignore. They presented themselves as guardians preventing chaos. But for a nation that has endured multiple coups since its independence in 1974, many citizens heard something different, another chapter in the same recurring story. Almost immediately after reading their communiqué, the military announced sweeping measures that transformed the country overnight. All borders, air, land, and sea were shut down without warning. International flights were grounded. Roads leading in and out of the capital were sealed. A nationwide curfew was imposed. Shops closed early. People rushed home, unsure how long they would be allowed outside or whether further violence would erupt. Amid all this, one question echoed across the city. Where was President Embalo? Rumors spread quickly. Some said he had fled. Others whispered that he was being protected inside the palace. The truth was unclear, and the military provided no answer. This uncertainty deepened the sense of instability among ordinary people who had seen similar crises unfold too many times before. At the same time, the streets of Bissau filled with visible tension. Soldiers took positions around key government buildings. Armored vehicles blocked alleyways leading toward the palace. Checkpoints sprang up across the city. For many witnessing this in real time, it was not just the sound of gunfire that shook them, it was the sight of their country slipping once again into the hands of uniformed men claiming national salvation. As these events unfolded, journalists sought clarity. Reporting live from Dakar, Senegal, correspondent Nicholas Hake confirmed what many feared: the military was fully in control, and the democratic process had been interrupted just as the nation stood at the edge of transition. He described a country frozen between a contested election and a forceful takeover, and a population caught in the middle with no certainty about what tomorrow would bring. For the citizens of Guinea-Bissau, the morning's gunfire was not only a sound, it was a reminder. A reminder that without trust in elections, the line between politics and military power can disappear overnight. As the day unfolded, the fear on the streets of Bissau turned into something heavier, something that felt like history repeating itself. Women who had sprinted away from the gunfire in the morning now waited behind closed shutters, listening for the next burst of shots. Fathers whispered updates to their families, trying to stay calm. Radios crackled with fragmented reports until one message rose above the noise: the military had officially taken control of the country. But the real shock was not the coup itself. Guinea-Bissau has experienced coups, attempted coups, and rumored coups for decades. What truly pushed the situation into its highest point of tension was the military's justification. They claimed the nation's political process had been infiltrated by drug barons, an accusation that carried a weight much deeper than politics. Guinea-Bissau isn't just one of Africa's poorest countries. It has long been labeled by the United Nations and the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as a narco-state, a transit hub where cocaine from Latin America is funneled into Europe. It is one of the darkest, most painful truths of the nation. Unimaginable wealth flows through its ports and islands, but almost none of it reaches ordinary citizens. Instead, it corrodes the political system from within. So when the military stood before cameras and announced that they had acted to prevent drug traffickers from destabilizing the election results, the country held its breath. Was this an act of protection or an exploitation of a real problem to justify seizing power? Within hours, reactions erupted across different layers of society. Civil society groups, those who had spent years advocating for transparency, expressed frustration, saying the election had not been free or fair from the beginning. Their concerns were not new. Major political parties, including the historically dominant PEIC, were barred from presenting a candidate. Opposition members faced intimidation. Voices who attempted to criticize the process were silenced. So when the military intervened, some citizens felt anger at the political elite, while others feared the army's return to power even more. For many older residents in Bissau, this crisis reawakened memories they had tried to forget: the chaos of past coups, the nights when gunfire became part of daily life, and the long periods where hope felt dangerous. They watched from behind barred windows as soldiers moved through the streets, suddenly in charge of deciding the nation's future. Internationally, the reaction was mixed, and in some circles deeply divided. Just days earlier, ecowas observers had praised the election as peaceful, a statement that now seemed disconnected from the realities raised by civic groups. To many in Guinea-Bissau, ECOWAS's endorsement felt like yet another example of powerful institutions choosing stability over truth. Social activists began repeating a painful accusation that ECOWAS had become a club for presidents trying to cling to power. At the same time, analysts across the region began comparing Guinea-Bissau's sudden collapse to the wider pattern sweeping West Africa. Niger had fallen to a military takeover, Mali before that, Burkina Faso before that. The trust in Western-style democracy, already fragile, was cracking even further. And Guinea-Bissau's unraveling seemed to confirm a growing belief that elections alone cannot fix nations drowning in corruption, poverty, and foreign influence. As night fell, the situation remained dangerously uncertain. The whereabouts of President Embalo were still unknown. Diaz continued to assert he had won. The military continued to insist that they had saved the nation. Ordinary people continued waiting for answers that would not come. And somewhere between all those claims, the truth was buried beneath layers of power, fear, and the long shadow of the cocaine trade, a shadow that has shaped Guinea-Bissau's fate for generations. For ordinary families in Guinea-Bissau, the immediate consequences of the coup were felt not through political statements, but through silence, an eerie, unfamiliar silence that settles over a city placed under curfew. Streets that would normally echo with children playing or vendors calling out their prices grew empty. Doors were locked earlier than usual, windows were shut tight, and every household waited for the next update, unsure if the gunfire might return. The closure of all borders, land, air, and sea, became one of the most visible signs of how deeply life had been disrupted. Travelers found themselves stranded in airports. Fishermen along the coast, who depend on the tide and the openness of the sea to survive, were told to stay ashore. Merchants who rely on goods coming from Senegal or the islands suddenly found their supply chains frozen. Even medical workers expressed fear that the lockdown could cut off urgent medications and supplies from entering the country. Inside the capital, the curfew reshaped daily life. Shops closed early long before sunset. Schools halted classes. Many who work in the informal economy, those selling food on street corners, cloth in small markets, or fresh produce from nearby villages, lost their income instantly. For a country already among the poorest in Africa, one day of lockdown could be devastating. Several days could break families completely. Yet the deeper effect was not merely economic, it was psychological. Guinea-Bissau is a nation where people have lived through repeated coups, and every older resident knows the feeling of waiting for political uncertainty to pass. Parents tried to calm their children even as they themselves felt the weight of uncertainty. With rumors swirling about the president's disappearance and both political camps claiming victory, confidence in the political process collapsed almost overnight. This loss of faith in elections did not appear out of nowhere. It had been building quietly for years. Civil society groups had long warned that the electoral process lacked transparency. The exclusion of major political actors like the PAGs from the race created resentment and suspicion. Many residents believed the election had been flawed even before the military stepped in. So when the coup occurred, people were left questioning whether the military had exploited political dysfunction or whether dysfunction had inevitably paved the way for military intervention. One of the most complex layers of this crisis lies in the country's relationship with drug trafficking. For decades, the cocaine trade has seeped into institutions from the military to politics and even into local administrations. And while massive profits flowed through the country, regular citizens saw none of it. Instead, they witnessed an economy eroded by corruption. The coup's claim that it was preventing narco-traffickers from influencing election results may have resonated with some, but it also fueled long-standing fears that no institution, whether political or military, is fully free from the influence of the drug networks that have plagued Guinea-Bissau for generations. Politically, the coup represents more than a contest between two presidential contenders. It exposes a system where power can change hands not through stable governance, but through forced suspicion and foreign influence. Democratic institutions already fragile now face the threat of being sidelined entirely. The international community's role, especially ecowas, has become a point of anger among citizens who feel ignored or misrepresented. In the end, the greatest casualty of the coup may not be any single political figure, but the people themselves, the ones who must live with the instability, the poverty, the uncertainty, and the fear. The civilians who wake up each time hoping their country might finally turn a corner, only to find themselves once again navigating a crisis that they never asked for. For many families in Guinea-Bissau, the coup's impact felt painfully: local curfews, shortages, uncertainty. But beyond the shuttered windows of Bissau, the world was also watching, and nowhere was the concern more intense than in Washington, Brussels, and the regional capitals of West Africa. To understand why, you have to look at the map, not as a set of borders, but as a network of global interests stretched across the Atlantic. To American policymakers, Guinea-Bissau has never been just a small, distant nation. For nearly 2 decades, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration has closely monitored the country because of its role in the transatlantic cocaine trade. Latin American cartels, especially from Brazil, have long used the shallow waters and remote islands of Guinea-Bissau as a gateway to Europe. American officials know that instability in this country doesn't stay contained. It ripples into European cities, affects transnational crime networks, and fuels a global supply chain of drugs that eventually reaches U.S. shores. This is why Washington views each coup in the region through a sharp strategic lens. A military takeover in a narco-state raises the question: who will control the flow of cocaine tomorrow? Will it be the same networks that infiltrated past governments, or will rival factions within the military now fight for influence? For the United States, the fear is not ideological, it is practical. Instability in Guinea-Bissau makes it harder to track trafficking operations, harder to maintain intelligence partnerships, and harder to ensure that criminal organizations don't expand their reach. Europe, especially Portugal and Spain, sees a different but equally worrying picture. They sit directly on the receiving end of the cocaine corridor. European law enforcement agencies know that every period of political turmoil in Guinea-Bissau historically leads to spikes in trafficking across the Atlantic. For Brussels, the coup isn't just an African crisis. It is a public health and security challenge waiting to spill over into European ports and streets. Meanwhile, ecowas, the regional body responsible for safeguarding democracy in West Africa, now faces one of the most uncomfortable tests in its history. Only days before the coup, ecowas had praised the elections as peaceful, yet civil society groups insisted that peaceful did not mean free and fair. Now, with tanks in the streets of Bissau and borders sealed, ECOWAS's credibility is called into question once again. Across the region, young people see the organization as out of touch, a defender of incumbents rather than voters. Neighboring countries are equally anxious. Senegal, which shares deep economic ties with Guinea-Bissau, worries about refugee flows and the interruption of cross-border trade. Gambia and Guinea fear that instability may embolden criminal networks in their own territories. And in the wider Sahel, where Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have already abandoned the Western-backed model of electoral democracy, the Guinea-Bissau coup feels like another domino falling. All of this leaves the United States facing an uncomfortable strategic dilemma. If elections alone cannot stabilize West Africa, what comes next? Should Washington continue supporting electoral frameworks that citizens no longer trust? Or will it need to rethink its approach to stability in a region where traditional democratic models are losing legitimacy? As Guinea-Bissau's crisis deepens, one thing becomes clear: the world cannot afford to look away. The country may be small, but the forces converging on it, crime, poverty, geopolitics, regional instability, are anything but. When night finally settled over Bissau, families remained indoors, whispering the same questions over dinner tables lit only by small lamps. How many more times must we live through this? How long before our children inherit something better? The immediate gunfire had stopped, but the uncertainty had not. In many homes, parents tucked their children into bed with soft reassurances they themselves did not fully believe. That is the quiet cost of instability. Its wounds do not always bleed, but they run deep. Guinea-Bissau's crisis is not an isolated tragedy. It is part of a growing storm stretching across West Africa, a storm fed by fragile elections, poverty, corruption, and foreign interference, sometimes through violence, sometimes through money, and sometimes through the shadows of the drug trade. A single coup in one small country might seem distant to many watching from abroad, but in reality, it is a signal flare warning that a wider system is failing one pillar at a time. And here is the uncomfortable truth: instability rarely stays within borders. In the Sahel, military takeovers in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso were born from the same frustrations: citizens who felt unheard, elections that produced no change, and systems that offered no real stability. Guinea-Bissau may not receive the same attention as larger nations, but its collapse affects trade networks, regional security, and even the global fight against organized crime. As Africa News continues to report on these unfolding events, many voices across the continent have echoed one sentiment: West Africa is approaching a crossroads. It can continue on a path where elections are held, but few trust them, or it can begin searching for new models of governance, models rooted in accountability, dignity, and genuine sovereignty. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso have already sparked debates about whether a new political structure is needed, one that addresses the deeper issues beyond ballots and polling stations. So tonight, as Guinea-Bissau faces another uncertain dawn, a question remains for all of us watching, especially those of us far from West Africa, but deeply invested in peace and stability. Do you believe that the traditional democratic model is enough for nations trapped between poverty, crime, and foreign influence? Or is West Africa now reaching for something entirely new? If you care about truth, if you follow Africa's search for stability, and if you believe ordinary people deserve more than the headlines they are given, then stay with us. Please share this video if you feel that you're among the few who truly want to understand the deeper forces shaping Africa's future. And subscribe if you believe that honest reporting matters more than political convenience.